Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. And this is such an extraordinarily rich and important and enjoyable workshop. In my 32 years with the United Nations, this really stands out. It's a great honor to be with you today. And I might have the longest title of all the events so far. I think I win that award. The first premise of my talk is straightforward and given and already well documented yesterday and today, and that is we are facing a twin crisis of climate change and loss of nature that is now threatening all life on the planet. The second premise of my talk is that an historically significant change is underway before our very eyes with respect to the growing understanding of and support for the critical role of Indigenous peoples in our world. And this is very good news because my third premise, that also does not require explanation to this group, is that Indigenous peoples' culture, ways of life, and spirituality have a powerful and positive impact in addressing those twin crises through their stewardship of their lands and their traditional knowledge. A fourth premise is that Indigenous knowledge and links to science, the focus of this conference, is vitally important, but the securing of rights to Indigenous lands and resources is a critical enabler without which Indigenous knowledge and culture are not sustained. This understanding and appreciation has been growing thanks to the heroic efforts of many of the leaders here, Vicky and Myrna and Hindu and Jennifer and Ali Ferrara and Stanley, Nigel, Torres, Virgilio, and many others. In my paper, I explore in detail key events, programs, and processes that have led to this increased power and influence of Indigenous peoples from the perspective of my 32 years in the United States, in the United Nations, starting with my first assignment, which was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. But I won't go into detail there now, only in my paper. But recently and significantly, inspired by His Holiness Pope Francis, many religious leaders and faith communities have joined this movement to support Indigenous people. His Holiness Pope Francis's visionary leadership on nature, climate, and Indigenous peoples has inspired many important efforts around the world, including one called the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, or IRI. IRI is based on the fact that Paulo Artaxo told us so clearly earlier today that the future of tropical forests is closely linked to the planet's future and is the cheapest, easiest, and fastest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to stop tropical deforestation. A number of you here today were key actors in the launch of IRI in 2017, and notably Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo. We're very grateful. And Her Excellency Sonia Guajajara and Vicky Talicorpus and Nigel Crawhall, Hindu and others have really been instrumental in this work. One of the most encouraging impacts of IRI that we have seen so far is the beginning of a healing of the historically broken relationship since colonization between major Western religions and Indigenous peoples. And of course, Pope Francis has contributed enormously to this healing in the world through his recognition and honoring Indigenous peoples and their spirituality on so many occasions, including through this conference and yesterday's audience. To share one anecdote, I was honored and deeply moved and inspired to participate with His Holiness in meetings with thousands of Indigenous peoples from throughout the Amazon who gathered in Puerto Maldonado, Peru in January 2018. There in the audience, Pope Francis expressed his profound respect and love for Indigenous peoples, their culture, knowledge, and spirituality, and thereby sent a powerful message of reconciliation around the world. I will now give examples of how IRI programs are contributing to Indigenous knowledge on the ground in the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Indonesia. IRI Brazil is managing two major innovative programs to educate millions of Brazilians on the climate crisis and Indigenous knowledge. And in particular, I want to thank again Her Excellency Minister Sonia Guajajara for her incredibly strong support for this work since the very beginning. Scientific immersion trainings are rigorous two-day training courses for Brazil's most influential religious and political leaders held in Brazil's top scientific institutions, Samaden and INPE. The focus is on the most current science, on the causes and prevention of climate disasters, and on alternative bioeconomy development models for the Amazon. This training combines the science of forest preservation with understanding of the importance of indigenous peoples to overcome these crises, both through the preservation of the existing forests on indigenous lands and also through the vast knowledge they have about the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of nature. The immersion training activates religious leaders in their own institutions to educate their constituencies and encourage political authorities to enact laws and policies that protect forests and respect the rights of indigenous peoples. This work is vitally important because the Brazilian public does not understand the connection between the climate disasters that are already occurring in their cities with the destruction of forests in remote Amazon region. We are seeing so many encouraging cases of how, after this immersion training, the hundreds of prominent Brazilian religious leaders from all faiths with millions of followers are using their own educational systems and social media to powerfully educate their followers about the scientific facts and indigenous knowledge related to the climate and biodiversity crises, and thereby reorienting their choices as voters and consumers. Hundreds of religious leaders. Here are the Catholic leaders in Brazil, and here the evangelical pastors from Brazil, and here's an interreligious group. There are many of these. The Amazonia Viva reality film is a dazzling, award-winning film based on indigenous knowledge that offers a 10-minute immersive experience of actually being inside the Amazon forest. The Amazon is mostly unknown, as Virgilio will surely tell us, to the vast majority of Brazilians, especially the younger generation. And the film is guided and narrated by Chief Raquel Tupinambas, a young woman indigenous leader from the state of Pará. The film's message combines the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples with modern scientific knowledge. The narrator, Raquel, tells us that it rains in the Amazon because there is a forest, and not there is a forest because there is rain, as science previously understood. In other words, it is the forest that causes the rain, not the rain that causes the forest. And if we destroy the forest, then we lose the rain needed for food and other needs. This is an example of ancestral indigenous knowledge from the Amazon. And the film is a powerful tool for raising awareness, education, and mobilization. And just last year, more than 50,000 people in Brazil personally experienced it. A rigorous study of the impact of the film shows the number of people who donated money to conservation after seeing the film increased by 50%, and people's perception of the importance of indigenous peoples and their knowledge for the preservation of the Amazon also increased after seeing this film. The film is now being distributed by many religious educational institutions and prominent museums throughout Brazil with constituencies of millions of people. Turning to Colombia, the IRI Colombia program also provides an excellent example of how indigenous knowledge and science can be brought together to address the climate and biodiversity crisis in local municipalities in the Amazon. IRI Colombia mapped the regions of the country with the highest rates of deforestation and the most violations of indigenous people's rights, and then launched local chapters of faith-based action coalitions in these areas. Here is where the forest in Colombia is. Here is where the Amazon is. Here is the areas of highest deforestation and violation of indigenous people's rights. And here is where the local chapters have been created, with the intention to use local, municipal, and statewide elections to further their goals. IRI Colombia brought candidates for mayor and governor together before the elections throughout the country in public debates that were broadcast widely on TV and radio. and where each candidate signed a commitment statement that said, if elected, they would actively promote rainforest protection and stand for Indigenous peoples' rights and knowledge. Then, after the elections, IRI Columbia representatives came back to the newly elected mayors and governors and said, okay, now let's work together. And they reached agreement on having IR representatives serve on local and statewide planning councils to monitor the follow-up to the commitments these elected officials had made earlier. By the end of 2023, just last year, 42 local chapters had been launched across the country to enable leaders from Indigenous peoples, the scientific community, and all the religions of the country to work powerfully together to protect nature and Indigenous knowledge. Turning now to the Democratic Republic of Congo, religious leaders contributed significantly to Indigenous issues by bringing their considerable moral authority and political influence to bear in support of a decade-long campaign led by the Indigenous peoples themselves, and to successfully lobby government to adopt a new law in November 2022 on the promotion and protection of the rights of the Indigenous peoples. This historic law is the country's first ever legislation to formally recognize and safeguard the rights, land tenure, and knowledge of Indigenous peoples, and is another high-impact example of how multi-faith action can make a difference on the ground for Indigenous peoples. Now looking at Indonesia. In Indonesia, just last month, religious leaders through the IRI Indonesia group, together with partners and led by the Ulama Council of Indonesia, MUI, the highest authority on Islamic law in the country, issued a fatwa against actions that cause climate change. A fatwa cites the Quran and carries significant moral weight with the majority Muslim population. Several important MUI fatwas have preceded this one, including in 2011, forbidding destructive mining operations, in 2014, forbidding activities which threaten endangered species, in 2016, forbidding the burning of forests and land. Most importantly, for the purposes of this workshop, the MUI is now planning work on a fatwa regarding the protection of Indigenous knowledge. The last country that we work with, Peru, has also had success over the past 3 years advocating with the Minister of Justice and Human Rights in Peru to adopt significant national legislation protecting environmental defenders. And the law has been effectively applied in a number of specific cases. To conclude, I have 6 points to conclude. One is Indigenous knowledge, culture, ways of life, and spirituality are key to avoiding cataclysmic outcomes from the twin climate and biodiversity crises, and the evidence base for this is growing every year. Number 2, securing Indigenous peoples' rights to their lands and resources is essential for Indigenous knowledge to be sustained. Number 3, this understanding, along with the allocation of more support and resources to Indigenous peoples, has been growing strongly over the past 3 decades since the Rio Earth Summit, along with powerful new partnerships among Indigenous peoples, scientists, United Nations, NGOs, philanthropies, and government, and most recently with religious leaders and communities. And number 4, I argue that this constitutes one of the most hopeful and important game-changing movements to generate effective action on climate and biodiversity. Number 5, one such partnership, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, inspired by Pope Francis, is demonstrating how faith communities and Indigenous peoples, scientists, and other sectors have formed influential and effective coalitions in key countries to stop tropical deforestation and protect Indigenous rights and knowledge. And the final point, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative's methodology and experience in tropical forest regions of the Amazon, Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia can inform and serve as a model for multi-faith efforts on Indigenous rights and other aspects of the climate and biodiversity crisis and in other geographies to help us find our way to have a viable future for all. Thank you.